Okay, we're just going to give a couple of minutes for people to switch over. All right. Okay, as people are moving into this session, I am absolutely delighted to welcome Stacia Garr, who is the co-founder and principal analyst for RedThread Research. Stacia is a thought leader in our people analytics space, and I am now an avid listener to her new podcast coming from RedThread Research. So it's all about the skills economy and really, really informative. So I am looking forward, Stacia, to you sharing some brand new information with us here in this conference. The stage is yours now. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity. And I'm excited whenever people say that they're joining or listening to the new podcast. We have really enjoyed putting that together. So thank you, Anna. Hello, everybody. I understand that you've had a pretty busy day, but I'm excited to have the opportunity to be a part of it, to talk about inclusive analytics, inclusion analytics, and what you need to know. As Anna said, I am Stacia Garr, and I am co-founder of RedThread Research. We're a human capital research and advisory firm, and we focus on a number of areas, but most relevant for today is people analytics, as Anna mentioned, but also DEIB. When we launched our research firm in 2018, DEIB and technology actually was the first area that we focused on. And so it's been an important area for us from the beginning, and I think it's only getting more important, as you all know. So in terms of what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to spend a bit of time very quickly going over terms and how we think about DEIB and why we're seeing this growing focus on DEIB analytics. We'll then dive into why inclusion analytics and what they are and how we can think about reinforcing those analytics. We'll then spend some time wrapping up, and I know we will have a few moments for questions. Just to orient you to what we're sharing today, here's an overview of our research to date. As I mentioned, when we launched RedThread, we began with that DEIB tech study, but we've done a whole bunch since then. And most relevant for today is a study on people analytics tech that we published in December of last year. And within that study, we obviously had a focus on DEIB. We also focused on a dedicated DEIB technology study, which came out in 2021. So that was an update to that original study that originally published in 2018. And since then, we've been doing a concerted research effort around DEIB and analytics. That has included a comprehensive literature review, like any good researcher, looking at approximately 50 articles on the topic and seeing what was out there. And then a series of interviews. We've done close to 20 interviews to date, and we're continuing to do those at the moment, and particularly trying to get more diversity and inclusion leaders involved in these interviews, because we think we know a lot about people analytics, but we need to get their perspective as well. In terms of our terms, I know that everyone often has different terms when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. These are ours. I'm not a fan of going through and reading detailed information on slides, and there's a lot here. So if you want to have a look, just go ahead and screen grab that real quick, and you can look at it. But you can see that we kind of see diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging as four related concepts, but definitely different concepts. And when we're talking about DEIB analytics, it really is the analytics or analysis and metrics that go around each of these different areas. So then if we talk about why are we talking about DEIB analytics? Why is there a growing focus in this area? And we think it comes down to three main reasons. The first is around consumer expectations. So we know that consumer expectations have really changed over the course of really the last 3 to 5 years when it comes to taking action. But clearly the situation that social justice movements and the events of last summer have galvanized our space and the need for us to take action even faster. There's some great data from Edelman Trust Index, if you're actually looking for data that supports this point, around consumer expectations around their companies taking action when it comes to social justice as well as diversity and inclusion. A second reason for this focus right now is that we've seen, as I'm sure you all know, higher rates of job loss amongst diverse employees during the pandemic. So we've seen a lot of statistics around the impact of the pandemic on women, but then also around people of color, so Black and Latino or Latina workers suffering from really higher levels of unemployment. So for instance, in February 2021, Black unemployment was at 9.9%, and for Latino and Latina, so it was at 8.5% respectively, and that was compared to 5.6% for white employees. So a really substantial difference. Also seen a lot of employees with disabilities lose their jobs during the pandemic. So this is especially relevant to those populations. And then finally, new SEC human capital reporting guidelines. So we know that those came out last November, and we started to see some reporting from companies on their human capital metrics. But what I think is interesting is that investors have finally seemed to catch on to this idea that diversity and inclusion can drive better business results. And so now that there's human capital reporting guidelines and expectations, they are starting to ask harder questions about what's happening with DEIB. So all of this coming together is bringing DEIB and thus DEIB analytics to the top of boards and CEOs' agendas, which means that we have a greater opportunity than before. Now, when it comes to what these are, we thought it could be useful to just do a kind of a quick comparison of diversity and inclusion analytics. So if we start with diversity analytics, as I'm sure you all know, it originated in the collection and reporting of standardized demographic groups from the EEOC. Now, it is largely focused on representation metrics, and it can be more straightforward than inclusion metrics. Now, I mentioned can be because we actually had a debate on my team about whether we even included this bullet, because we all know that it can also be pretty complex. Do you, on the EEOC forms, you will just have men and women, but now we know that we should also be including things like, if somebody is binary or if they are trans, and so there's just a number of other levels of subtlety that we need to be thinking about when it comes to these diversity metrics. Same thing when we're thinking about, for instance, capturing LGBTQ, or thinking through the nuances of tracking race or ethnicity, particularly outside the United States, and everything, understanding the legal requirements in some areas versus others. So not trying to say this is easy, it's not, but it can be more straightforward than inclusion analytics, if nothing else, because we've been doing it for a longer time. So let's go to the focus of today, which is inclusion analytics. And first thing to kind of recognize about inclusion analytics is that the definition tends to vary by organization. So I gave you our definition at the very beginning of this talk around what inclusion means. But this can obviously vary. Sometimes people will lump inclusion and belonging together. Sometimes they are also including equity within this. But there's kind of for the sake of today, we're kind of lumping all those together for simplicity, but there is important variability there. Right now, when it comes to inclusion analytics, we're tending to see companies largely focus on metrics that reflect employee perception and sentiment. But we think that's only one part of the puzzle. It can actually go beyond that, and I'm going to talk about that. And when we go beyond that, though, it can get increasing in complexity, whether you're talking about data collection methods or analysis approaches, and certainly security and privacy. So those are all things to be considerate of, but I think there's a lot of opportunity when it comes to inclusion analytics to go beyond just kind of surface level. Historically, we've seen a bigger focus on measuring diversity than inclusion. This is some data from just before the pandemic. Unfortunately, I haven't found any more up-to-date data than this, but found about 92% of organizations measure workforce diversity or plan to within the next year, but that number drops to 77% when we're talking about inclusion. Now, this all kind of begs the question of why should we be measuring inclusion analytics at all? And we think this comes down to three things. First is people. So inclusion analytics allows us to understand our people and their perspective at a much more nuanced level. So we can understand things like if individuals feel connected to others in the workplace, and we can look at that by different types of groups. We can measure the strength of bonds and connections that exist between employees and as well as within teams. And we can also find out if employees feel valued and find meaning in their work, and understand which parts of the organization people may not be having that experience, or for which groups they may not be having that same strong employee experience, and be able to address it. The other thing that it can do is allow us to focus on process. So we can identify unfair and potentially unintentionally biased systems, practices, and processes through inclusion analytics. So for instance, we're able to understand who might have better access to development opportunities, or if performance management scores and feedback vary based on people's demographic groups across the overall organization. And also look at things like promotion opportunities, succession opportunities, and the processes that we use to get there, and if those might have some bias in them. The final reason is really around kind of prediction power. So a lot of organizations are focused on representation data, and making sure that they have folks who are equally represented compared to the broader population. Inclusion can help. It can be a leading indicator to those representation metrics. And so understanding inclusion and understanding what's actually driving behaviors and driving promotion and driving intent to stay can give us that power of prediction for the future of where we're going to be able to get to for a representation numbers. So those are some of the reasons. I'm sure that there are others out there. Now, when we are looking at DEIB analytics holistically, and we've had these interviews with folks, we've said, what's table stakes, and then what is kind of next level analytics when it comes to DEIB? And without hesitation, every people analytics leader we've talked to has said diversity analytics is table stakes. So having an understanding of what the org looks like, how diversity manifests, what types of groups we have, et cetera, and getting a good handle on those numbers is table stakes. Okay, cool. So let's go on to inclusion. We have found that inclusion analytics tends to break into two groups. The first here is perceived inclusion analytics. So this is really about capturing employees' perceptions of their personal levels of inclusion within their organization. That's one type of inclusion analytics. That is the most common type of inclusion analytics that we see. But then there's objective inclusion analytics. And this is actually analyzing objective data. So things that are happening, not people's perceptions, but things that are happening by different diversity characteristics to understand those different groups' experiences. So let's talk about what each of these is and give an example. So with perceived inclusion, again, this is this measure of an employee's level of inclusion captured via perception data. There are a lot of different ways that we can capture this information. This is some nice data from I4CP that shows different types of org strategies for measuring perceived inclusion. Perceived inclusion is our bucket. We just put all their data kind of into this relevant bucket. But you can see things like employee engagement and culture surveys, pulse surveys, inclusion indices, stay or exit interviews. So all of these things is information that we're asking employees for, and then we're looking at it by different diversity demographics. That's kind of I think this is what most people see. One example that I want to call out here, which I think is particularly interesting, is the last one in this chart, which is comments on external employee forums. So people giving their perceptions outside the organization, so not directly to the organization, and then organizations analyzing that data to understand those perceptions. So nice kind of common example of what this looks like is from Box, so the technology company. And there's a nice example of how they launched an inclusion survey to gather baseline data on how different groups of employees experience inclusion. So they had nearly 70% of their 1,500 employees globally provide feedback. And what they found was that 82% of Boxers overall reported a favorable sense of belonging, which was what their closest correlation to overall inclusion. But then looking deeper into the results, they were able to identify a group that was not having that same experience. And so they actually found that group did a really good job of hiring women, but they did a worse job of actually creating an inclusive environment for them. And so as a result of that effort, they identified that group as well as some other groups within the organization that also had different experiences, and created different strategies to try to help those groups feel more connected to the organization and more included. So they did things like using employee resource groups to connect those individuals. They also made some process changes. So for instance, for this example of women, they found that one of the things that kind of made them feel the least included, or at least less valued, was around some of those common administrative tasks, such as note taking or cleaning up common spaces. And so they actually created an expectation throughout the organization that those tasks would be assigned and they would rotate amongst team members, so that it was a much more equitable distribution of some of that type of work. So I included the source for this particular story, so if anybody wants to go read a little bit more about that. But I think that's a nice example, simple example of how you can use perception inclusion and analyze the results and then get to action. Now let's go into objective inclusion, which I think is where we have a huge amount of opportunity in our space. So objective inclusion is, as I said, the measure of employees' inclusion as reflective in objective data, what's actually happening. And this we're seeing is less commonly done. So again, if we use some of that I4CP data, and we see that they had measured on analyzing things like promotion and development and movement rates of direct reports. It's a reasonably common, about a third of companies do that. And then analysis of productivity data by different demographic groups. We're seeing, roughly 10% of organizations doing that. Now, in our interviews, we saw quite a bit more in terms of things that could be done. And so I'm going to just share this slide, which has a whole bunch of different ideas and examples of what we saw in our interviews. So we saw, for instance, on the upper left, an organization looking at succession lists. And there was a company that told us a great story about how they analyzed the ready now candidates for succession, those who are dubbed as ready within a year or 18 months, I think it was, and those ready more than 2 to 3 years out. And then they took that data and they compared that data to their leadership assessment data. And they actually found that the candidates who were on the ready now and those who were on the ready within 18 months had the same leadership assessment scores. But do you know what the determining factor was and whether they were ready now or ready within 18 months? You guessed it, diversity status. So they actually changed the way that they were thinking about their succession lists so that they could have, I think they decided to call it just ready now. Full stop, not ready within 18 months, but ready now or ready later. And that by doing that, they were able to adjust this differentiation and to increase more opportunities to these succession candidates. So that's just one example. You can see some others that are really nice here in terms of, for instance, performance scores analysis, to looking at that. Also, we're seeing NLP, natural language processing, on written feedback being used more, particularly for performance feedback, but it can also be used some more with succession feedback or feedback on candidates within the hiring process, et cetera. Another example, in this one we actually have a real-world thread, is that on that lower left, analyzing response time and tone in emails. So we have an example here from SAP, the large German multinational software company, where they were actually looking to help their managers and perform a bit more effectively, particularly when it came to stronger communications with their direct reports. So they partnered with a people analytics solution that could give their managers feedback on the emails that they were sending to their direct reports. So things around their tone, around their response time, and then they could analyze that by diversity characteristics. So for instance, do managers in our organization, or do I as a manager tend to respond to one type of group more quickly than another, and what might be happening there? This was especially interesting in general when it came to the pandemic, because you could see how communication norms and approaches changed during the pandemic. But what they found was that they found some really positive results. Specifically, 83% of their managers said that this tool improved their self-awareness of how they interact with the team. And that, we know that self-awareness of what we're doing and how we're doing it can be a big change, can help us make a big change in terms of our behaviors, particularly when it comes to diversity. Now, how might you go about using some of this information in your own organization to build inclusive analytics? So we have a few suggestions. One is considering inclusion in all of your people practices and analytics approaches. And I'm going to talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. Second, sharing that inclusion data broadly. And then finally, leveraging tech to create scale. So if we look at that first one, considering inclusion in everything, first, obviously, we want to build inclusive people practices, but most importantly, along with that, we want to build a measurement of those people practices to make sure that they are inclusive. So if, back to my succession management example, if you're doing succession management, make sure you have a measurement approach check for whether inclusion is really happening and there's equitable access to opportunities. Second, being creative with analytic approaches. So I mentioned using, for instance, natural language processing for feedback. We're seeing an example of people using well-being data and analyzing that by DEIB characteristics. So we're seeing a lot of creativity and a lot of people thinking like, okay, this is happening. What might we do to understand if it's fair and if it's equitable? And then finally, adjust for inclusion in existing data. So we're seeing, for instance, organizations that are beginning, if you're looking at that perception data, beginning their journey, they're looking at, do we have any items already in place that can measure inclusion or measure belonging, or do we have an inclusion index that might already be there in some part of the business that we didn't think about? So look at what you already have. That second point, sharing inclusion broadly. We find that inclusion data is being shared really at the top of the house, but not necessarily as we get farther down the organization. So 65% versus 28% for employees. And so broadly, we encourage organizations to share more data, to push more data down, because if you're looking to drive change, you can't do it if it's all held at the top. And then finally, using tech to create scale. So consider inclusion analytics in your dashboards. Consider, again, back to that pushing data out. Providing tools for employees to share their feedback broadly and regularly. So that's back to that perception data. And then using tech to connect disparate data within the org. That example of succession management is, a really nice example of how you can use different data across the organization. So just wrapping up, inclusive analytics we know is critical for DEIB. We encourage you to look beyond employee perception data, but it's important to look there too. And then building inclusive analytics throughout the organization. I mentioned a moment ago that if you're focusing on DEIB and people analytics as a practitioner, we would love to talk to you. This is research that's ongoing. And so there's my contact information. And in general, we'd love to be connected. There's all of our contact information for RedThread and for me on LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out on LinkedIn, and we'd love to talk. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Stacia. We have time for a question or two. So how do you see organizations evolve in accepting, I think your comment about this data being shared almost exclusively at the top of the house. How do you see this trickle down and it really influence operations and everything that we do all the way in your organization?
Yeah, I think it goes back to creating a data-driven culture, something that we've talked about in so many other contexts, and starting and getting people comfortable with it. So an example of one organization we talked to was they started with the senior leaders and making sure they were comfortable with the data. And they said, okay, we're going to give managers just this subset of the data. They're not going to see the whole picture, but they're going to see the subset of what's relevant to them. And so they started inserting that information into managers' existing dashboards. So it wasn't like this DEIB data thing out here on the side. It was just like, hey, we're going to just add a little bit more data to these folks so that they can make decisions. And then there was some training and education that went around that. And then, continuing to, that was first, pretty senior managers, and then they cascaded on down. But I think, the key is that it takes time. You got to get everyone comfortable, and it should be part of the work that's already being done. In terms of analytics, it shouldn't be just something that sits over on the side and gets a whole bunch of attention once a year and then kind of goes away.
Yeah, and I will finish with a comment from Emily Dalgish, who is one of our students. She is with Bank of New York Mellon, and she said that it's very relevant to her current job, so she'll be reaching out for more information. All right, thank you all so much, Stacia. Thank you, and we will look forward to more research coming from your organization. As I said, I'm a big fan and always follow. So we are going to take a quick switch over to our next panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.